Moves into it.
You're listening to A View from the Hill,
There it goes. It's high enough. It's long enough.
the Rugby League supporters program.
The beauty. It's straight between the posts. The try in out.
Hello and welcome to That's the Way It Was, a program that looks back at the history of rugby league. In episode 12, in 1995, the game of rugby league was at war with itself. Clubs, officials, players and supporters had turned on each other. Sponsors were walking away. TV ratings were down, and most importantly, the game's supporters were disillusioned and disappearing. The game needed something uplifting to change its fortunes. It needed something inspirational to give it a lift. In short, the game needed a miracle, and that miracle would arrive with the 1995 State of Origin series. To discuss this series and its impact on the game of rugby league, we're going to speak to Robert Burgin, who's written a new book called Maroon Mentality. Robert was a journalist for Rugby League Week and is the co-founder of the Latin Heat Rugby League. So, Robert, welcome to That's the Way It Was.
Thanks very much, Rob. Pleasure to be here.
Now, Rob, can you briefly just outline to us what sort of impact the Super League war was having on the game of rugby league?
Yeah, looking back before this episode to go over my notes, it seems even more fantastical than I remembered at the time. And we saw people were getting sacked left, right and centre. You know, they stood down some of the referees who'd aligned with Super League, including
Yes.
Bill Harrigan. Some of the coaches, Graham Murray, Peter Mulholland, their positions were considered untenable. Even before this series, Wayne Bennett described it as a farce. Those were the exact words that he used of the looming State of Origin series. So it really didn't have the expectation of anything like it eventuated to be.
Yes, yes. Now, Robert, one of the byproducts of the war, I suppose you could call it a race. There was this race to sign as many players as possible from both sides. And it appears as though the ARL was using the upcoming State of Origin series to lure players to its side, to lure players to sign with the ARL. Was that correct? Or was that how you saw things going?
Yeah, I mean, there were the threats there that, representative football wouldn't be open to players who align themselves with Super League. And when we look back on this series, it almost seems like New South Wales, Queensland became about Super League versus ARL because, as we know, the Broncos were chief instigators in all of this, and then the Cowboys were on board very early as well, which robbed them of the possibility of fielding most of their usual representative players. And this was at a time where people like Alfie Langer were all over the TV. They were massive stars of the game. And for the game to go without them on this occasion was a huge gamble.
But it was never official, was it, Robert? There was never any official ban of the State of the Super League players. It was sort of like you hear these comments from various ARL types about, we're planning for the future and so forth. This was their sort of like the reasons they were using for the upcoming State of Origin series.
Yeah, I believe it was pretty much headlined in newspapers that was going to happen, and no doubt those journalists got tips off from people central to the game. But I think they backed off stating it openly at the outset of the series, purely because there may have been some sort of legal recourse if it was constantly referred to that was the case. But I think everyone knew full and well that's what the situation was.
Yeah, it sort of became official. I suppose you could say it became official when the annual city versus country teams were announced. This was a couple of weeks before the first State of Origin match, but a couple of weeks before they played the annual city versus country fixture, and it became quite obvious then that the Super League players were not going to be picked in these representative sides. So, Robert, the announcement of this city versus country team, it sparks sort of like a chain reaction. A whole host of decisions are made because of these teams being announced. The first decision, you've already mentioned it, Wayne Bennett, who was the Queensland coach, he steps down as Queensland coach. As you said there, he said, quote, "I don't want to be part of a farce." He's heavily criticised. People saying that he only wants to coach the best players, but I suppose Robert. Wayne Bennett's sort of in a bit of a he's between a rock and a hard place, so to speak.
Definitely, and we can see he aligned himself with some of those power brokers in the game for years to come. And of course, there were many friendships tested out of this, but I think, Wayne already had a few strained relationships with the Queensland Rugby League, and there's probably a bigger story there about the background to it. And, maybe the Broncos had tested the patience of the Queensland Rugby League on several fronts as well.
Yes. Stretching
right back to the days when, the franchise was open for a Brisbane team to join the New South Wales Rugby League in the mid-'80s. The franchise that eventually got the go wasn't necessarily who the QRL were backing, and we saw a few of those little, fracases occur over the years, and this became kind of the tipping point.
All right, now the next decision that is made is by the Queensland Rugby League, who announced that, a former Origin player and TV commentator Paul Vaughton will coach Queensland. And Robert, what was the reaction to Paul Vaughton being named as Queensland coach?
Well, it's probably important to preface that Queensland had lost the last 3 series before this.
Yes.
This as well. So, people could have thought they were hiding to nothing, certainly. And then, for someone who'd made his career in recent times as a kind of a comedian that was willing to get dressed up in pantomime and women's clothes, etc., in the form of Fatty Vaughton, people thought it was a bit of a joke. But I know that early on in the piece, he laid down the law to the players and said, who I am on TV is not who you're going to have as a coach. So he was very keen to separate those two identities of his.
Yes, well, okay, so this is the other thing that's going on at this time. There's a lot of speculation now about who's actually going to get picked for these, New South Wales and more particularly for Queensland, because Queensland, as you said, they had lost the previous 3 series. They were going to be without, a whole host of players there. Alan Langer, the Walters brothers, Steve Renouf, Hancock, Willie Kahn, Gordon Tallis, all of these players were suddenly not available. New South Wales as well were without, the likes of Ricky Stewart and Laurie Daly, Brad Clyde. They were missing that. They were going to miss out on those players. There was actually at one point, Robert, a suggestion that the ARL might let Kevin and Steve Walters play in the State of Origin. Now, what was the thinking here, do you think? Why were they suddenly sort of opening the door to a couple of Super League players?
Oh, well, I think they realised it was at desperation stakes. And as we look back and in writing the book Maroon Mentality, I don't think you can argue that Wayne Bartram at hooker is probably the loosest application of the State of Origin eligibility rules ever. I mean, he grew up in New South Wales, played his junior football in New South Wales, came to the Seagulls, who at the time, were on the New South Wales side of the border.
Yes.
So it was quite a stretch of the imagination to say he could play. I know Adrian Lamb was also quite a contentious decision, but at least he played all his junior football in Queensland.
Yeah.
And as you say, I think New South Wales went into this with 9 international players available for them, or that were picked. And for Queensland, there was only Adrian Lamb and Dale Shearer, who of course was coming towards the end of his prime years.
All right, so there was also a suggestion at one point that Super League were going to stage a State of Origin match in opposition to the first game, but of course, that never happens. So we come down to the selection of the teams for the first State of Origin. Robert, I'll just read out these 2 teams and I'll get you to make a comment on them. For New South Wales, Tim Brasher was the fullback. On the wings, you had Rod Wishart from the Illawarra Steelers and Manly's Craig Hancock. The centres were Terry Hill and Paul McGregor. The halves were the Johns brothers, Matthew and Andrew from Newcastle. Brad Fittler was the lock, and he was named as captain of the team. Brad Mackay and Steve Menzies were the second rowers. Paul Harrigan and Mark Carroll were the props. And Jim Sedaris from Western Suburbs was a hooker. On the bench there you had the North Sydney players Greg Florimo, David Fairley and Matt Sears, and Adam Muir from Newcastle, with, of course, Phil Gould as a coach. So, Robert, what were your basically thoughts about that New South Wales side?
It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, is it? And I think that was when Andrew Johns got his first chance at a New South Wales Origin jersey. So it's not like they hurt themselves too much. I think possibly you could say they're a little bit weak in the outside backs with some of the selections they made through that series, but otherwise pretty strong across the board.
And I suppose, I think there was, some consternation about Brad Fittler being named the captain. I think there was a lot of support for Paul Harrigan, especially after what had gone on with Newcastle. But no, Brad Fittler, I suppose he was the face of the ARL at that point of time, so he was named the captain. Now, the Queensland team. Robbie O'Davis is the fullback. On the wing, you've got Brett Dallas and Matt Singh. The centres were Mark Coyne from St George and Danny Moore from Manly. Dale Shearer, as you mentioned, he's the 5'8". Adrian Lamb from Eastern Suburbs, very controversial selection at half. Billy Moore is the lock forward. Gary Larson is in the second row with the captain of the team, who's Trevor Gilmeister. Now, Trevor, he's now playing for the South Queensland Crushers. You've got Gavin Allen, who's playing in the reserves, actually, at Brisbane. He's in the front row with Tony Hearn. And the St George lock forward, Wayne Bartram, is the hooker. On the bench, you've got a very young Ben Eichen from the Gold Coast, and the three South Queensland players, Terry Cook, Mark Hone, and Craig Teven. Of course, remembering that South Queensland Crushers were one of the new teams introduced to the competition in 1995. Robert, the Courier Mail described the team as, and I'll quote here, a ragtag team of rejects, rookies, reserve graders, and resolute veterans. So, Robert, what is your... are there any players in that team that you'd like to highlight?
I think an interesting one, first up, is Craig Teven in the aspect, he's number 17 there on the bench. And,
yes.
Probably would consider one of the last players that were picked, but his father actually used to play with Arthur Beetson out in Roma, and they're on the same team together. Uh-huh. So it kind of brings the Origin legend full circle. And I believe Craig Teven's father is even mentioned in Artie's autobiography.
Right.
So looking through that, it's people probably don't know about the adversity that a lot of these players faced or the long road that they took, and we'll touch on some more of those as we go through. But I thought that was very interesting. Of course, Ben Eichen is one that a lot of people mention about in this series because it was his coming of age. And speaking to him from our own mentality, he said at the time he was on a $3,000 contract with the Gold Coast for a year. And then suddenly in the State of Origin, not only is he playing before packed stadiums, but he's also earning $23,000 from 3 games of football. So this completely changed his life at that point in time.
All right, okay. Let's come to the first match of the series, Monday the 15th of May 1995 at the Sydney Football Stadium. New South Wales are 9-1 on favourites. Queensland are receiving 19.5-point start with the TAB. As Queensland come out onto the field, you can hear someone in the tunnel yelling out Queenslander, and that becomes significant down the track. We'll talk about that a bit later. But the game itself, New South Wales almost scored in the opening minutes there. There was a crossfield kick, was taken by Rod Wishart, but he went into touch as he tried to cross the try line. New South Wales had the first attempt at scoring in the 12th minute. Rod Wishart missed a fairly easy shot at penalty goal. But it was in the 30th minute Paul Harrigan was penalised, and Wayne Bartram kicked the goal. He missed an earlier shot at penalty goal. That made it 2-0. But, well, Robert, what were your memories of that first match?
Oh, I actually really loved this game, and it was such a hard, gritty match, and probably only a Queenslander could say that, because if you were watching this as a New South Wales fan, it would have been incredibly frustrating and perhaps dour. But I think Queenslanders had such an expectation of being blown off the park that to see them grind out this 2-0, I think just that at halftime gave everyone a little glimpse of hope. And they were probably, even if they'd lost the second half, they would have been happy to be at that score. But of course, it went on to become, one of the all-time great victories.
Yes, it was the only trialist of the lowest scoring state of origin in the history of the competition. It was the only trialist state of origin as well. But I just sort of thought that, I think that New South Wales thought that with the Johns brothers at half, that they'd have some sort of good combination, of course, with Brad Fittler there as well. But if anything, New South Wales looked very disorganised. But the one thing that did stand out was Queensland's defence. They defended incredibly well. There were times during this match where they were under all sorts of pressure. But some tremendous last-ditch defending kept them in the game and eventually won the game for them. Gary Larson, the North Sydney second rower, was the player of the match. It's the actual number of tackles he made is sort of like, some say 60 tackles, there's others saying 53 and that. But he was the player of the match. I thought the St George pair, I thought Wayne Bartram actually had a very good game as well, as did Mark Coyne. And Mark Coyne was under quite some pressure going into this game, because on the evening of the game, a few hours before the game started, there were press reports saying that Mark Coyne had signed a contract with Super League, which he had to sort of come out and deny, vehemently before the game was played. But all right, now game two. Before the match, I'll just both teams do make some changes. For Queensland, the only change is that Jason Smith from Canterbury replaces Dale Shearer at 5'8". For New South Wales, there are a number of positional changes. Brad Fittler moving to 5'8". Greg Florimo is selected in the second row, with David Barnhill from St George. Steve Menzies goes back to the bench. He's joined there by the Illawarra fullback Brett Rotwell. But the other big change for New South Wales is that Dean Pay from Canterbury is selected in the front row to replace Mark Carroll. And Robert, both Jason Smith and Dean Pay, they've been playing in the reserves at Canterbury, haven't they?
Yeah, that's a really remarkable storyline of this series, is the fact that they were seemingly destined to be Super League players to start with, and then Jason Smith turned around and rejected that notion and was brought into this whole series and played a big part in the grit and determination that shaped the side.
But it does fit with the narrative of that the ARL was picking players who had signed with the ARL, and of course Dean Pay was one of the 4 Canterbury players that had rejected the Super League contracts and had gone back to the ARL. So game 2 is played on a Wednesday, 31st of May, and this game has been played at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. But Robert, this match, even before the match started, everyone was talking about the first scrum. It seemed as though everyone knew what was going to happen in this first scrum.
Here's the first scrum that we were talking about. Yeah, Sedaris is throwing the first one, and we'll have plenty involved in just a moment.
Well, they've come from everywhere like it was almost a rehearsal.
Yeah, the word went out that New South Wales were going to punch anyone who had the Queenslander call after, Billy Moore made it so pronounced in the first game. They were sick of it, wanted to quell it, didn't like what it stood for. And then I think, Queensland even had a concept of that ahead of the the scrum, and they weren't willing to back down. So the legend is that they all shouted it out in unison at that first scrum, which led to absolute chaos. And
yes,
it was entertaining, that's for sure.
Yes, it was. At the end of it all, it appeared that Jim Serratus, who was the New South Wales hooker, it appeared as though he started everything, but in the end, New South Wales got the penalty from that scrum. In the match itself, Queensland were first to score. Jason Smith put in a little chip kick there, which was knocked on by Tim Brasher, and Mark Coyne picked up the ball and scored under the post. They shared penalty goals there, and it was 8-2 at half-time. But again, Robert, your memories of this match, the second match down in Melbourne?
I think Brett Dallas really stood out in this one for me. I don't think you can deny that image of him flying along with his bright red hair, yes, and then Fatty in the stands with his bright red hair cheering him on. Just a magnificent storyline, because Brett Dallas was actually in the same athletics group as Kathy Freeman, and the AIS had come to Mackay, wanted him to go down and train for the Olympics, but he chose a different path with the Bulldogs and then on to North Sydney. So for him, he could have been contesting a 2000 Olympics if he hadn't found himself in that position, but just a massive sliding doors moment for so many of the players in this.
Yeah, the game really sort of, it was, again, a bit of a close, tight affair. I mean, Queensland probably got the big advantage there in the 66th minute. Terry Cook had come onto the field and he threw a very nice inside pass for Adrian Lamb to score, and that made it 14-6. There was a late surge from New South Wales. Jim Serratus scored under the post to make it 14-12. But again, some incredible defence. I mentioned there earlier Terry Cook. He made a couple of very big tackles in this. He held up Steve Menzies over the line. Steve Menzies was held up over the line by Terry Cook late in the game. He also made a very important tackle in the first half, just before half-time on Terry Hill. Terry Cook, what can you tell us about him, Robert?
Terry has quite a remarkable background story. So when he was 12 years old, his father suffered a couple of strokes within a few days of each other. He went to hospital, and at that stage his dad was working in an electricity business and was due to take it over from the boss. And he actually passed away on the day they were due to take the business over. So what that meant is not only did he lose his hero and his father at a young age, but the family lost their financial means. And Terry had to go to work at a very young age. And I think something you see from all his performances was he was a very tradesman-like performer. And he had a tough road to get to first grade. You know, he didn't play for Gold Coast until he was almost 26 years old. He'd gone to, a fairly obscure club in England in Bramley. He'd gone to play for the Bow Desert Kingfishers in the Gold Coast hinterland, and then found himself at Gold Coast. And then by the time he made it to State of Origin, he's almost 30 years old. So he definitely did it the hard way. And a nice little story that people might not know is that he played against Wally Lewis way back in 1987, the very first Toowoomba Clydesdales team that ever made the State League final. And he was just a young man there. So he spanned... he'd emerged at a time when Wally Lewis was at his game, and then finally got his chance in Origin, several years after Wally had departed the scene, and I think was, on the sidelines during this game.
Right, yes, yeah. The game went right down to the wire because, as I said, Jim Serratus scored late to make it 14-12. There was a bit of a controversial decision in the last minute. Tim Brasher scored a try off a Brad Fittler pass, but... referee Eddie Ward ruled it forward, and it was from Queensland won the resulting scrum from that decision. And as you said there, Brett Dallas from dummy half running 90 metres to score the winning try, and that gave the game to Queensland by 20 points to 12. Jason Smith was named man of the match. He did have a very big impact, but as I said, Terry Cook did stand out, mate. They had a very big game that he made a number of very important plays, and Adrian Lamb as well. His kicking, I think, was far superior to the kicking game from Matthew and Andrew John, for New South Wales. Now, Game 3, Monday the 12th of June 1985, and there's a record crowd at Lang Park in Brisbane to watch this game. Queensland, there's no changes, but Robert, their captain, Trevin Gilmeister, was in extreme doubt leading into this match.
Yeah, so he had a blood infection, was on an IV drip in hospital, and then his family came to visit him, the coaches all came to visit him, and he ended up effectively pulling the drip out and going to the game, and then after it was all over, checking himself back into hospital to continue treatment.
Well, some of the doctors were apparently sort of telling that, well, he could die because of this infection. So it was a very brave decision to get out on the field and play. For New South Wales, again, there are a number of positional changes, but probably the biggest change is that Jeff Tuvey from Manly is selected at halfback. Matthew Johns returns at 5'8", and Brad Fittler, the captain, goes back to the lock forward. But now again, Queensland started well. In the 12th minute, Jason Smith scores a fairly easy try. It was just one off the ruck there from about 10 metres out. But Robert, as this game unfolded, there were a number of occasions when Queensland looked well beaten in this match.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, the scoreline, to end up what it was, New South Wales were already ahead 16-12 with not far to go in the game. So they really had the upper hand. And for it to end up the way it did, as much a shock for anyone. And you could have been sort of forgiven, or the Queensland players could have been forgiven for switching off after already sealing the series and defying the critics. But clearly they had a little bit more left to play for.
But no, again, as I said, New South Wales, they put themselves in attacking positions many times, but there would be a bad pass or a drop pass or a very poor kick on the last tackle or something. There were periods there where they were virtually camped on Queensland's line, but they just could not score, mate. Queensland's defence kept them out, and as you said, the New South Wales led very late into the game. Jason Smith makes a break, and he finds Brett Dallas inside there, and Brett Dallas gave New South Wales an 18-6 lead. And of course, the game ends with an Adrian Lamb bomb, which Matt Sears drops, and Ben Eichen, the youngster from Gold Coast, is there to pick up the ball and run 20 metres to score. Queensland win by 24 points to 16. And Robert, Gary Larson, he's named player of the series after the match.
Yeah, this was a breakout year for Gary. He'd already been in the State of Origin team. People knew he was a great player, but this was the moment where I think everyone across the competitions thought, well, he's really a premier forward in the ARL at this stage. And I read a quote from Jack Gibson of that year, and he said if he had to pick a team, Gary Larson would be the first player signed, which I think is a remarkable testament to his ability. And,
yes.
Again, just sort of trawling back through the archives on a little-known fact is Gary Larson was actually a winger in the Australian schoolboys team that Ricky Stewart played in. So he'd grown up as an outside back and then became a massive workaholic forward. And I think he was Queensland champion in 200 metres, 400 metres and 800 metres. So you can see where he got his big motor from, but that's quite a transformation over the course of a few short years.
Yes, yeah. So now, Robert, finally, in your book, in your new book there, Maroon Mentality, you look into the backgrounds of the players who have represented Queensland. What would you say about the 1995 Queensland side? What was the Maroon mentality of that 1995 side?
Well, I think hardship. I've spoken about a few of the players losing their their fathers or role models early on. I think a search for identity, a sense of belonging. Even Adrian Lamb talks about he could remember the day that his family left Papua New Guinea and he wasn't sure where his life was going. There's plenty of players within this side that had gone through adversity, and certainly no one with a silver spoon in their mouth, so to speak. So even though there were no expectations of them, they'd all had to fight hard to establish their careers in the first place. So to them, this was one more thing that they weren't expected to achieve in their life. So perhaps there's something in that.
That's the way it was back in 1995. My name's Rob Corra. On behalf of Robert Burgin, this program was produced by Tony Peterson. Until next time, may the force be with you.